The letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning, and the moment Elena Whitfield saw the golden seal on the envelope, her hands went cold. She knew that seal. She had hated that seal for 6 long years. It belonged to the Cross family, the same family that had once made her feel like nothing more than dust under their polished shoes. She stood in the small kitchen of her townhouse, the smell of coffee still hanging in the air, and stared at the envelope as if it might bite her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal and pulled out the thick cream paper inside. The handwriting was elegant, practiced, the kind of handwriting that came from expensive schools and private tutors. She did not need to read the signature to know who had written it. She already knew. Nathaniel Cross was getting married, and he wanted her there to see it. Elena read the words twice, then a third time, searching for some hidden kindness in them, some small trace of the man she had once loved. There was none. The invitation was polite on the surface, the kind of politeness that cut deeper than any insult. It read like a performance, every word chosen to remind her of what she had lost and what he had gained. "You are cordially invited to witness the marriage of Nathaniel Cross to Miss Camille Ashford," it said, as though she were nothing more than a stranger being granted a favor, as though 6 years of marriage, 6 years of shared meals and quiet nights and promises whispered in the dark, had never happened at all. She set the letter down on the counter and closed her eyes. For a moment the years rolled backward, and she was young again, standing in the grand hallway of the Cross family estate, wearing a dress that cost more than her father had earned in a year, feeling like she did not belong in her own skin. She remembered the way Nathaniel's mother, Margaret Cross, had looked at her the first time they met, the way her eyes had traveled from Elena's worn shoes to her simple hairstyle, silently calculating her worth and finding it lacking. She remembered the whispers behind closed doors. The girl has no name, no fortune, nothing to offer this family. She remembered Nathaniel's promises that none of it mattered, that he loved her, that he would protect her from his family's cruelty. She remembered believing him. She remembered being wrong. Elena opened her eyes and looked at the invitation again. 6 years ago, Nathaniel had left her with nothing but a stack of unpaid bills and a note that said he needed to think about his future. He had not come back. He had not called. He had simply vanished from her life like smoke, leaving her to face his family's fury alone, to endure the whispers of a society that blamed her for a marriage that had never truly stood a chance. She had lost everything that year, her home, her friends, her place in a world that had never really accepted her to begin with. She remembered nights spent crying into a pillow in a rented room above a bakery, wondering what she had done wrong, wondering if she would ever matter to anyone again. But that was 6 years ago. Elena walked to the window and looked out at the gray morning light spilling over the rooftops of the city. She was not that frightened young woman anymore. She had built something for herself, something real, something that no one could take away. She thought of the long journey that had brought her here, the years of hard work, the trust she had earned from a man who saw her worth when no one else had. She thought of Duke Alaric of Gravenhurst. He had found her when she had nothing left, working as a clerk in a small estate office, quiet and unnoticed, doing work that no one else wanted to do. He had noticed her sharp mind, her honesty, her refusal to bow to flattery or fear. Over the years, he had taught her everything about managing an estate, about handling people, about standing tall even when the world tried to make her small. He had become the closest thing to family she had left. And now, after everything, she carried a title that the Cross family could never have imagined. Elena picked up the invitation again and turned it over in her hands. She could see exactly what Nathaniel intended. He wanted her to walk into that wedding as the broken, forgotten wife, the cautionary tale whispered about at parties, the proof that he had moved on to something better. He wanted an audience for her humiliation. A small, cold smile touched her lips. He had no idea who she had become. She thought about refusing the invitation entirely, about tossing it into the fire and forgetting it existed. It would have been easy. No one would have blamed her for staying away. But something inside her, something steady and certain, told her that walking away was not the answer. She had spent 6 years rebuilding herself in silence, far from the eyes of the people who had once dismissed her. Perhaps it was time they saw exactly what silence had built. She thought of Sophie, her closest friend and now her personal assistant, who would no doubt have opinions about all of this the moment she heard. As if summoned by the thought, Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her coat, cheeks pink from the cold outside. She took one look at Elena's face and stopped walking. "What happened?" Sophie asked, setting down the bag of groceries she carried. Elena held up the invitation without a word. Sophie crossed the room and took it from her hands, scanning the words quickly. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to quiet anger in the span of a few seconds. "He actually sent this," Sophie said, her voice tight. "After everything he did, he has the nerve to invite you to watch him marry someone else." "He wants me there," Elena said quietly. "He wants everyone to see me sitting in that room, alone, forgotten, while he starts a new life with a beautiful young bride from a good family. He wants to prove to his mother, to his friends, to himself, that leaving me was the right choice." Sophie's jaw tightened. "Then don't go. Why give him the satisfaction?" Elena walked back to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. For a long moment, she said nothing at all. "I'm going to go," she said finally. Sophie stared at her. "Elena, why would you do that to yourself?" "Because he doesn't know what I've become," Elena said, turning to face her friend. "He still thinks I'm the same girl who left his family's estate with nothing but 2 suitcases and a broken heart. He thinks I've spent 6 years disappearing quietly somewhere, waiting for him to notice me again. He has no idea about the Duke, about Gravenhurst, about any of it." Sophie's eyes widened slowly as understanding dawned on her face. "You want to walk in there as the Duchess. I want to walk in there as myself," Elena said, "whatever that means to people like him." The two women stood in silence for a moment, the rain tapping steadily against the window pane, the city noise humming faintly beyond the glass. Sophie finally let out a breath and shook her head, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite herself. "You are either the bravest woman I know, or you have completely lost your mind," Sophie said. "Maybe both," Elena replied. Later that evening, after Sophie had gone home, Elena sat alone in her study, the invitation resting on the desk in front of her, the Cross family seal catching the lamplight. She thought about the letters she had received over the years from Nathaniel's mother, filled with quiet cruelty disguised as concern, questioning her worth, questioning her right to the Cross name even after the divorce had stripped it from her completely. She thought about the isolation of those first months after Nathaniel left, how she had learned to survive on her own, how every small victory had felt like proof that she could rebuild what he had destroyed. She thought about the day Duke Alaric had called her into his study, his health failing, his eyes tired but sharp, and told her that he intended to name her his heir. "I have watched you for years," he had said. "You have more strength in your quiet moments than most men have in their loudest ones. This estate, this title, they mean nothing if they are not carried by someone who understands what it costs to earn respect rather than inherit it." She had wept that day, not from joy alone, but from the sheer weight of finally being seen. Now, sitting in the lamplight with the wedding invitation before her, Elena understood something clearly for the first time. This was not about revenge. She did not need to destroy Nathaniel Cross to prove her worth. She had already proven it, quietly, over years of work that no one from his world had ever witnessed. This was about closing a door that had been left open far too long, about walking through the wreckage of her old life one final time, not as a victim, but as a woman who had built something greater on her own. She picked up a pen and began to write her reply, her handwriting steady and calm. "I would be honored to attend," she wrote. "Please expect the presence of Elena, Duchess of Gravenhurst." She sealed the letter, set it aside for the morning post, and allowed herself, for the first time in years, a genuine smile. Somewhere across the city, in a grand house filled with wedding preparations and fresh flowers, Nathaniel Cross had no idea that the letter he had sent as a weapon was about to become the very thing that unraveled everything he had built. The wedding was 3 weeks away, and Elena intended to make sure it was a day no one in that room would ever forget. That night, long after Sophie had left and the house had grown quiet, Elena found herself unable to sleep. She sat by the window in her nightgown, a cup of cooling tea forgotten on the small table beside her, watching the rain finally ease into a soft mist over the rooftops. Her mind kept drifting back to the early days with Nathaniel, before the cruelty of his family had worn her down, before she understood how little his love could shield her from the world he came from. She remembered the first time he had taken her hand in a crowded ballroom, whispering that he did not care what anyone thought of her background, that all that mattered was how she made him feel. She had believed him with her whole heart. She had been young enough, hopeful enough, to think that love alone could carry two people through anything. It had taken years of silence and abandonment to teach her otherwise. She thought of the letters Margaret Cross had sent after the divorce, each one dressed in polite language but carrying a blade beneath the surface. Elena had kept every single one, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder of exactly what she had survived. She rose from her chair and walked to the small wooden box on her desk, lifting the lid and running her fingers over the folded papers inside. She did not need to reread them. She knew every word. "You were never truly one of us," one letter had said. "My son was kind enough to try, but blood tells eventually, and yours was never meant to mix with ours." Elena closed the box and set it back down, feeling nothing but a calm, distant sadness now, the kind that came from a wound long since healed over. She was not the same woman who had once cried over words like those. She had learned, slowly and painfully, that her worth had never depended on the approval of people who measured value in old names and inherited fortunes. She thought of Duke Alaric again, of the quiet mornings they had spent walking the grounds of Gravenhurst together while he explained the responsibilities that came with the title he would one day pass to her. He had never once asked about her past, never once questioned where she came from. He had only asked whether she was willing to work, willing to learn, willing to carry the weight of a legacy with honesty instead of pride. "I have seen many people born into power who never deserved it," he had told her once, standing beneath the old oak trees near the eastern gate of the estate, "and I have seen a rare few who earned every inch of it through their own hands. You are the second kind, Elena. Never let anyone convince you otherwise." Those words had carried her through the loneliest years of her life, through the long nights of learning ledgers and land agreements, through the slow and careful process of proving herself to tenants and stewards who had every reason to doubt a stranger stepping into such a position. She had earned their trust one small decision at a time, one fair judgment after another, until the name Gravenhurst no longer felt borrowed. It felt like home. Elena finally rose from her seat by the window and walked back toward her bed, though sleep still felt far away. She thought about what it would mean to stand in that church in 3 weeks, to face Nathaniel and his family again after all this time. She was not afraid of them anymore, not the way she once had been. What she felt instead was something closer to clarity, a quiet understanding that this moment had been waiting for her all along, patient and inevitable. She thought of Camille Ashford, the young woman set to become the next Mrs. Cross, and felt an unexpected flicker of sympathy. Whatever cruelty Camille might be capable of, she likely had no idea what kind of family she was marrying into, no understanding of how quickly kindness could turn to calculation behind those polished walls. Elena wondered, briefly, if she should feel guilt for what her presence might unravel that day. She decided she did not. The truth was not a weapon. It was simply the truth, and if it happened to unsettle a wedding built on someone else's cruelty, that was not something Elena needed to carry the blame for. She had spent enough years carrying blame that was never hers to bear. As she finally drifted toward sleep, her last thoughts were not of Nathaniel or his family at all, but of the estate waiting for her at Gravenhurst, the tenants who depended on her, the quiet life she had built stone by stone out of the ruins Nathaniel had left behind. Whatever happened at that wedding, she reminded herself, her life no longer depended on his approval or his family's judgment. She had already won the only battle that mattered. Outside, the rain finally stopped, and the first pale light of dawn began to creep quietly over the city, marking the start of the 3 weeks that would change everything. The first time Elena set foot inside the Gravenhurst estate office, she had nothing but a worn coat, a borrowed pen, and a fear so deep it sat like a stone in her chest. She did not know then that the small, dusty room with its towering shelves of ledgers would become the place where she rebuilt her entire life from nothing. It had been only weeks since Nathaniel disappeared from her world, leaving behind unpaid debts and a silence that echoed through every empty room of the house they had shared. She remembered standing in that house for the last time, watching movers carry away furniture that had never truly felt like hers, and understanding with a cold, sinking certainty that she had nowhere left to go. She had taken the first job she could find, a clerical position managing correspondence for a distant, aging nobleman she had never met, a man known only as the Duke of Gravenhurst. The pay was modest, the work unglamorous, but it came with something she desperately needed at the time. It came with distance from the city, from the whispers, from the family that had made her feel small every single day of her marriage. She arrived at the estate on a cold autumn morning, carrying a single suitcase and a heart still raw from betrayal. The housekeeper who greeted her, a stern but fair woman named Margaret Doyle, looked her over once and said only one thing before showing her to her small room above the stables. "Work hard here, and no one will ask about your past." Elena had clung to those words like a lifeline. For the first few months, she barely saw the Duke at all. He was an older man, quiet and reserved, known throughout the estate for his sharp mind and his impatience with foolishness. She learned about him mostly through the whispers of other staff, who spoke of him with a strange mixture of respect and caution. He had no children, no wife, no heir waiting in line to inherit the vast lands and responsibilities of Gravenhurst. Rumors swirled about what would happen to the estate once he was gone. Rumors that Elena paid little attention to at the time, focused as she was on simply surviving each day. She threw herself into her work with a determination that surprised even her. She organized decades of disorganized correspondence, corrected errors in the estate's records that had gone unnoticed for years, and slowly began to understand the intricate workings of a great estate, from tenant agreements to seasonal harvests, to the delicate balance of maintaining relationships with neighboring landowners. It was nearly 6 months before the Duke first spoke to her directly. She had been working late one evening, correcting an error in a decades-old land agreement that had confused 3 generations of stewards before her, when the door to the study opened and the Duke himself stepped inside. Elena rose immediately, startled, expecting to be scolded for working past the hour she was permitted in his private study. Instead, he simply asked what she was doing. She explained the error carefully, walking him through the discrepancy she had found between 2 conflicting documents, showing him exactly where a previous steward had misread a boundary line decades earlier, an error that had quietly cost the estate income for years without anyone noticing. The Duke had said nothing for a long moment, simply studying her with an expression she could not read. Then he had asked her name properly for the first time, and asked her to sit down. That evening marked the beginning of everything that followed. Over the following months, the Duke began calling on her more frequently, first for small clarifications about the estate's records, then for her opinions on matters of greater consequence. He tested her constantly, she would later realize, presenting her with problems that had no easy answers, watching carefully how she reasoned through them, how she balanced fairness with practicality, how she treated the tenants and staff whose lives depended on the decisions made in that study. She never knew, during those early months, that she was being quietly evaluated for something far greater than a clerical position. The Duke was a widower who had lost his wife decades earlier and had never remarried. His only son had died young, before ever marrying or having children of his own, leaving the Duke without a direct heir to the title and estate he had spent his life building. Distant relatives circled the family fortune like vultures, each one convinced they deserved to inherit Gravenhurst, each one, in the Duke's private opinion, more interested in the estate's wealth than its people. He confided this to Elena one evening nearly 2 years into her employment as they walked together through the eastern gardens after a long day of estate business. He spoke with a quiet bitterness about relatives who visited only when they wanted something, who spoke of the tenants and staff as though they were simply assets to be managed rather than people to be cared for. "I built this place with the belief that responsibility matters more than blood," he told her that evening. "I have watched you for 2 years now, Elena. You do not simply follow instructions. You understand why the instructions exist in the first place. That is rare. That is something I cannot teach." She had not understood, at the time, exactly what he meant by those words. It took another 3 years before he finally told her his intentions directly. By then, Elena had risen from a simple clerk to the estate's chief steward, managing nearly every aspect of Gravenhurst's daily operations, trusted by tenants and staff alike, respected by neighboring estates who had once dismissed her as nothing more than the Duke's assistant. She had grown into her role slowly, painfully at times, learning through mistakes as much as successes. She remembered the first harvest season she oversaw alone, terrified of failing the tenants who depended on fair distribution of resources, staying awake through countless nights reviewing records to ensure nothing was overlooked. She remembered the difficult decisions, turning away distant relatives who came seeking loans against the estate's future, standing firm against pressure from men who assumed a woman in her position could be easily persuaded or intimidated. Each challenge had hardened something inside her, not into bitterness, but into a quiet, unshakable confidence she had never possessed during her years with Nathaniel. The day the Duke called her into his study to discuss his will remains one of the clearest memories of her life. He had grown visibly frailer by then, his once steady hands trembling slightly as he poured tea for the two of them, a ritual they had shared countless times over the years. "I have made my decision," he told her that afternoon. "Gravenhurst will pass to you, in full, upon my death. The title, the lands, the responsibilities, all of it." Elena remembered the shock that had rendered her speechless, the disbelief that had made her question whether she had heard him correctly. She remembered his patient explanation, how he had already spoken with his lawyers, how the legal arrangements were already in motion, how his distant relatives would contest it, certainly, but how the law and his clear intentions would protect her claim. "You have earned this 100 times over," he told her firmly, cutting off her attempts to protest. "I do not make this decision from pity or sentiment. I make it because you are the only person I trust to carry this legacy forward with the integrity it deserves. The transition was not easy. When the Duke passed away peacefully 18 months later, surrounded by the staff who had come to love him, his distant relatives had indeed contested the will exactly as he predicted, filling courtrooms with accusations and demands, questioning Elena's character, her past, her right to inherit anything at all. She had faced them with the same quiet strength that had carried her through every difficult moment since Nathaniel abandoned her. She had produced years of meticulous records proving her competent management of the estate. She had brought forward tenants and staff willing to testify to her fairness and dedication. She had faced down lawyers and distant cousins who looked at her the same way Margaret Cross once had, with the same cold calculation, the same assumption that she did not belong among people of standing. She had won. The court had upheld the Duke's will completely, recognizing not only his legal right to name his own heir, but the clear evidence of Elena's capability and dedication to the role she had already been performing for years. The distant relatives, humiliated by the public revelation of their own greed during the proceedings, had retreated from society's attention entirely, their reputations quietly damaged by their own actions. Elena, Duchess of Gravenhurst, had emerged from that battle exactly as she had emerged from every battle before it. Stronger, steadier, more certain than ever of her own worth. Now, sitting in her study 3 weeks before Nathaniel's wedding, Elena thought about how far she had traveled since that cold autumn morning when she arrived at Gravenhurst with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. She thought about the tenants who now greeted her with genuine warmth, the staff who trusted her judgment without hesitation, the neighboring estates that sought her counsel on matters of importance. She thought about how none of it, not one single moment of it, had anything to do with Nathaniel Cross or his family's approval. And she thought, with a growing sense of calm certainty, about what it would mean to walk back into their world for one final evening, carrying everything she had built entirely on her own. She was not going to that wedding as a victim seeking closure. She was going as proof that the people who discard others sometimes discard exactly the person who was destined to rise higher than they ever could. Sophie arrived early the next morning to help Elena begin preparing for the journey back to the city, and found her already awake, standing in the study with old estate records spread across the desk, reviewing the very first ledgers she had ever corrected for the Duke all those years ago. "Reliving old memories," Sophie asked gently, setting down a tray of tea. "Reminding myself where I started," Elena replied, closing the ledger carefully. "It helps to remember exactly how far the road has been." Sophie studied her friend's face for a long moment, seeing something steady and resolved there that had not been present just days earlier. "Whatever happens at that wedding," she said, "I think Nathaniel Cross has no idea what he invited into that church." Elena allowed herself a small, quiet smile. "No," she agreed, "he truly does not." Later that afternoon, Elena walked the grounds of Gravenhurst alone, something she often did when her mind felt too full for words. The estate stretched out before her in every direction, fields turning gold with the approaching autumn harvest, distant workers moving steadily through rows of crops that would feed families throughout the coming winter. She had walked this same path hundreds of times over the years, yet it never failed to remind her of how completely her life had changed. She passed the small cottage near the eastern boundary where old Mr. Findlay lived, one of the estate's longest-serving tenants, a man who had worked the land since before the Duke's own father held the title. He waved to her from his garden, calling out a friendly greeting, and she stopped to speak with him for a few minutes, asking after his health and his granddaughter's upcoming wedding, a much smaller and far kinder celebration than the one waiting for Elena in the city. "It's good to see you smiling, Your Grace," Mr. Findlay said, leaning on his fence. "Been a while since I've seen that look on your face." Elena had not realized how visible her recent turmoil had been to those around her. "Has it been that obvious?" she asked. The old man chuckled softly. "Nothing gets past folks who've spent their whole lives watching the weather change. You've had a storm coming for a while now. Looks like it might finally be passing." She thanked him and continued her walk, thinking about his words long after she left his cottage behind. A storm passing. Perhaps that was exactly what this wedding represented, not a return to old wounds, but the final clearing of a sky that had been clouded for far too long. As she walked, her thoughts drifted back to the early days of her transformation at Gravenhurst, to lessons the Duke had taught her that extended far beyond estate management. She remembered one particular conversation, perhaps 3 years into her time there, when she had come to him frustrated after a difficult meeting with a neighboring landowner who had tried to take advantage of what he assumed was her inexperience. She had wanted to respond with anger, to prove herself through force and confrontation, but the Duke had gently redirected her. Power that needs to shout is usually power that doubts itself, he had told her, settling into his favorite chair by the fire. True authority does not need to prove anything to anyone. It simply exists, calm and certain, and lets others come to their own conclusions. She had carried that lesson with her through every difficult negotiation since, through every moment when lesser men had underestimated her because of her gender, her past, or simply her quiet demeanor. She had learned to let her competence speak louder than any argument, to let results silence doubts that words alone never could. It was a lesson, she realized now, that would serve her well at Nathaniel's wedding. She did not need to shout her worth in that church. She did not need to seek confrontation or demand acknowledgement. She simply needed to exist within that space as exactly who she had become, and let the truth settle over the room on its own. Her thoughts turned then to Camille Ashford, the woman set to marry Nathaniel in a matter of weeks. Elena had done some quiet research after receiving the invitation, curious despite herself about the woman who would soon carry the cross name. What she had learned painted a picture of a young woman from a respectable but modest family, recently elevated by her engagement to Nathaniel, eager to please his demanding mother, uncertain of her own place within a family known for its exacting standards. Elena recognized pieces of her own younger self in what she learned, and felt a complicated mixture of sympathy and caution. She had no desire to hurt an innocent woman who likely understood little about the family she was marrying into. But neither did she intend to shrink from the truth simply to spare feelings that Nathaniel's own cruelty had put at risk long before Elena ever received her invitation. As evening approached, Elena made her way back toward the main house, the sky above Gravenhurst turning shades of amber and rose as the sun began its descent. She paused at the top of the hill overlooking the estate, the same spot where the Duke had once told her that responsibility mattered more than blood, and allowed herself a moment of quiet gratitude for everything that had brought her to this point. Whatever waited for her in the city, whatever cruelty Nathaniel and his family still hoped to inflict, she would face it from this place of strength, carrying with her every lesson she had learned, every battle she had won, every year of quiet determination that had built the life she now called her own. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had arrived at this estate with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. She was Elena, Duchess of Gravenhurst, and she intended to walk into that wedding exactly as herself, letting 6 years of silence finally speak louder than anything Nathaniel Cross could ever say. The carriage rolled to a stop outside her old townhouse, and Elena stepped down onto the familiar cobblestone street for the first time in nearly 2 years. The city looked exactly as she remembered it, tall buildings crowding narrow lanes, the constant hum of carts and voices filling the air, yet something about it felt distant now, as though she were visiting a place from someone else's memory rather than her own. Sophie followed close behind, carrying 2 smaller bags while the estate staff unloaded the rest of their luggage. "It's strange being back here, isn't it?" Sophie said, glancing up at the townhouse Elena had kept but rarely visited since inheriting Gravenhurst. "Strange is one word for it," Elena replied, climbing the front steps. Word of her return spread faster than Elena had anticipated. By the second morning, invitations began arriving at her door, from acquaintances she had not heard from in years, from society hostesses eager to secure her presence at their gatherings, from distant connections who suddenly remembered her existence now that whispers of her new title had begun circulating through the city's drawing rooms. She recognized the pattern immediately. These were many of the same people who had turned their backs on her the moment her marriage collapsed, who had crossed streets to avoid conversation, who had let her disappear from their social circles without a single word of concern. Now that rumors placed a Duchess title beside her name, their memories had apparently improved considerably. Elena declined most of the invitations politely, choosing instead to spend her days quietly preparing for the wedding and reconnecting with the small handful of genuine friends who had remained loyal to her even during the darkest years. One such friend, a kind and sharp-witted woman named Lucy Bennett, arrived on her 3rd afternoon back in the city, arms full of pastries and gossip in equal measure. "You would not believe the talk going around," Lucy said, settling into the parlor with the easy familiarity of old friendship. "Half the city cannot decide if the rumors about you are true, and the other half is simply desperate to know the details before anyone else does." "What exactly are they saying?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew. "That you inherited some grand estate up north, that you carry a title now, that the Cross family invited you to the wedding not realizing what you had become." Lucy grinned wickedly. "Naturally, I have been enjoying myself immensely, refusing to confirm or deny any of it." Elena laughed despite herself, the sound surprising her with how genuine it felt. "It is all true," she admitted. "Every word of it." Lucy's eyes widened with delight. Then Nathaniel Cross truly has no idea what he invited into that wedding. None whatsoever, Elena confirmed. The news, once confirmed by someone within Elena's inner circle, spread through society with remarkable speed. Within a week, the name Duchess of Gravenhurst had become a fixture in every fashionable conversation across the city. Whispered behind fans at tea parties, discussed in hushed tones at gentlemen's clubs, speculated about endlessly by those who remembered Elena only as the quiet, discarded wife of Nathaniel Cross. The reaction from those who had once dismissed her ranged from disbelief to open embarrassment. Elena encountered several such reactions firsthand during a rare public outing to purchase fabric for a new gown, when a woman named Vivian Ashcroft, who had once been among the loudest voices mocking Elena's humble origins during her marriage, approached her with an expression of forced warmth that fooled no one. "Elena, darling, how wonderful to see you," Vivian said, her smile tight and uncertain. "We simply must catch up properly. It has been far too long since we last spoke." Elena regarded her calmly, remembering with perfect clarity the afternoon Vivian had loudly questioned, within Elena's hearing, how someone with no family name had managed to marry into the Cross fortune at all. "It has indeed been a long time," Elena replied simply, offering nothing more than polite acknowledgement before continuing on her way. Vivian's expression faltered slightly as Elena walked past, and Elena felt no satisfaction in the moment, only a quiet confirmation of everything she had already understood about the shallow nature of the world she had once tried so hard to belong to. Meanwhile, across the city, word of Elena's transformation had reached the Cross household with considerably less grace. Nathaniel first heard the rumors from his mother, who arrived at his townhouse one afternoon in a state of visible agitation, her usual composure cracked by genuine alarm. She found him in his study, reviewing wedding arrangements with his assistant, and dismissed the young man from the room with a curt wave, before turning her attention fully to her son. "Have you heard what they are saying about her?" Margaret Cross demanded without preamble. Nathaniel looked up, confused by his mother's uncharacteristic urgency. "Saying about who?" "About Elena," his mother snapped. "The rumors have reached every corner of society. They say she inherited a title. They say she now holds land and wealth that rival our own family's holdings. They are calling her Duchess of Gravenhurst." Nathaniel's first reaction was disbelief, followed swiftly by dismissal. "That is absurd," he said, returning his attention to the papers on his desk. "Elena had nothing when I left her. She had no family, no connections, nothing that could possibly explain a title of that magnitude. Someone is clearly exaggerating a rumor for their own amusement." His mother's expression remained tense despite his confidence. "I hope you are right," she said. "Because if these rumors prove true, and she arrives at your wedding with a title that outranks our own family's standing, the humiliation will not fall on her, Nathaniel. It will fall on us." Nathaniel dismissed his mother's concerns, though a small seed of doubt had already taken root despite his attempts to ignore it. He spent that evening making quiet inquiries among his circle of acquaintances, expecting to easily disprove the rumors and put his mother's worries to rest. Instead, each inquiry only confirmed the growing scope of the story circulating through the city. By the end of the week, even Nathaniel could no longer deny that something significant had happened during Elena's years of apparent silence. His fiancée, Camille Ashford, learned of the rumors through considerably less dignified channels, overhearing two guests discussing them in hushed tones during a dress fitting for her wedding gown. She had said nothing at the time, continuing through the fitting with practiced composure, but the moment she returned home, she confronted Nathaniel directly, her usual gentle demeanor replaced by something sharper and more anxious. "Is it true?" Camille asked without any greeting, finding him in the drawing room reviewing seating arrangements for the ceremony. "Is your former wife truly some kind of duchess now?" Nathaniel set down his papers, choosing his words carefully. "I do not know what she has become," he admitted reluctantly. "But regardless of any title she might carry, she remains nothing more than a footnote in my past. Her presence at our wedding changes nothing about our future together." Camille studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the reassurance she desperately wanted to find there. "And why exactly did you invite a footnote from your past to witness our future?" she asked quietly. The question hung heavily in the air between them, and Nathaniel found himself without a satisfying answer. The truth, one he had barely admitted even to himself, was that he had sent the invitation specifically to remind Elena of everything she had lost, to ensure she understood precisely how far he had risen since discarding her, to secure one final moment of superiority over a woman who had once dared to believe she belonged in his world. Now, faced with rumors that painted an entirely different picture, That same invitation felt less like a triumph and more like a decision he could no longer fully control. I invited her because it seemed only proper, given our history, he said finally, the explanation sounding hollow even to his own ears. Camille did not appear convinced, but she said nothing further, retreating instead into a tense silence that would linger between them for the remaining weeks before the wedding. Back at her townhouse, Elena remained largely unaware of the turmoil her presence had already begun stirring within the Cross household, though she suspected the rumors had certainly reached them by now. She spent her days finalizing estate business that had traveled with her from Gravenhurst, meeting occasionally with old friends like Lucy, and preparing carefully for the day that would mark her final, deliberate reappearance within the world that had once cast her aside. Sophie helped her select a gown for the occasion, something elegant but understated, befitting a woman who no longer needed elaborate displays to command a room. Elena rejected several options that felt too eager to impress, settling finally on a deep sapphire gown that reflected quiet confidence rather than desperate ambition. "You look like exactly what you are," Sophie said approvingly, studying Elena in the gown during a final fitting. "Someone who has nothing left to prove." Elena studied her own reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the composed, self-assured woman looking back at her. It had taken 6 years of struggle, of quiet determination, of building something real out of the wreckage Nathaniel had left behind, to become this version of herself. She thought of all the moments along that journey that had tested her resolve, the court battles over her inheritance, the skepticism of tenants who initially doubted a woman's ability to manage such vast responsibilities, the isolation of those first difficult months at Gravenhurst when she had nothing but her own determination to rely upon. Every one of those trials had shaped her into someone capable of walking calmly into a room full of people who had once dismissed her entirely, without needing their approval or fearing their judgment. 2 days before the wedding, Elena received an unexpected visitor. She was reviewing correspondence in her study when Sophie entered to announce that Nathaniel's mother had arrived, requesting a private audience. Elena considered refusing the visit entirely, but curiosity, along with a desire to understand exactly what the Cross family now believed about her transformation, convinced her to receive Margaret Cross in her parlor. The older woman entered with far less confidence than Elena remembered from years past, her usual commanding presence noticeably diminished. She studied Elena carefully, taking in the elegant surroundings of the townhouse, the quiet authority in Elena's posture, searching for evidence to confirm or deny the rumors that had brought her here. "You look well," Margaret said finally, her tone carefully neutral. "Thank you," Elena replied simply, offering nothing further. "I understand there have been rumors circulating," Margaret continued, her composure clearly strained beneath the surface. "About some inheritance. Some title." "They are not rumors," Elena said calmly. "I am Duchess of Gravenhurst, in full standing, recognized by both law and society." The color drained slightly from Margaret's face, though she attempted to maintain her composure. "And you intend to attend my son's wedding carrying this title?" "I intend to attend as myself," Elena replied. "Whatever title accompanies that is simply a fact, not a performance." Margaret studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, clearly searching for some remnant of the frightened, uncertain young woman she remembered from years past. Finding none, she rose from her seat, her expression unreadable. "I hope, for everyone's sake, that you do not intend to use this occasion to embarrass my family," she said, her voice carrying a faint edge of warning. Elena rose as well, meeting the older woman's gaze steadily. "I have no intention of embarrassing anyone," she said honestly. "I intend only to attend a wedding I was invited to, exactly as the person I have become. Whatever discomfort that causes is not something I am responsible for." Margaret left shortly after, her carefully composed exterior clearly shaken by the confidence radiating from a woman she had once considered beneath her family's notice. Elena watched her carriage disappear down the street, feeling neither triumph nor malice, only a quiet, steady sense that everything was finally falling into place exactly as it should. The wedding was 2 days away, and for the first time since receiving that gilded invitation weeks earlier, Elena felt completely, calmly ready. That evening, Lucy returned to the townhouse, unable to resist hearing the details of Margaret Cross's unexpected visit. She listened with wide eyes as Elena recounted the conversation, shaking her head in disbelief by the time the story concluded. "She actually came here herself," Lucy said, pouring 2 cups of tea with hands still slightly unsteady from excitement. "I would have paid good money to see her face when she realized the rumors were true." "It was not quite as dramatic as you are imagining," Elena said, accepting the cup with a faint smile. "She simply wanted confirmation, and warning, in equal measure." "Warning about what exactly?" Lucy asked. That you might dare to exist in the same room as her precious family? Elena considered the question for a moment, turning her cup slowly in her hands. I think she is afraid of what people will say, she said finally. Not for my sake, but for the family's reputation. The Cross name has always mattered more to her than anything else, including her own son's happiness. Lucy studied her friend carefully, noting the absence of bitterness in her voice, the steady calm that had replaced the raw pain Elena once carried whenever the Cross family was mentioned. You have changed so much, Lucy said softly. I remember how devastated you were those first months after Nathaniel left. I worried you might never recover from it. I worried about that too, Elena admitted. There were nights I genuinely believed I would never feel like myself again. But somewhere along the way, rebuilding everything from nothing, I stopped trying to become the person I used to be, and started becoming someone entirely new instead. Someone stronger, Lucy said. Someone free, Elena corrected gently. The strength came later. Freedom came first. The two friends sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the evening light fading slowly outside the parlor windows. Lucy eventually broke the quiet, her expression turning more serious than before. Are you nervous? About the wedding itself? She asked. Elena considered the question honestly before answering. Not nervous exactly, she said. Perhaps more curious than anything else. Curious to see how Nathaniel reacts when he realizes the woman he intended to humiliate no longer needs anything from him or his family. And Camille, Lucy asked, have you given any thought to her in all of this? Elena's expression softened slightly. I have thought about her more than you might expect, she admitted. She is young, and likely has no real understanding of what she is marrying into. I have no desire to hurt her deliberately. Whatever unfolds at that wedding will be the result of Nathaniel's own choices, not mine. That is remarkably gracious of you, considering everything, Lucy said. Elena shrugged softly. I spent years being the person everyone assumed deserved whatever cruelty came her way, simply because she did not come from money or status. I refuse to become someone who inflicts that same judgment on another woman, simply because circumstances have changed. The following day passed quietly, filled with final preparations for the wedding. Elena reviewed correspondence from Gravenhurst, ensuring the estate remained in capable hands during her brief absence, and met with her lawyer to finalize several matters related to her position that had arisen since her return to the city. In the late afternoon, she received word that Camille Ashford had requested a private meeting, delivered through a brief, carefully worded note that revealed little about the young woman's true intentions. Elena considered the request for some time before deciding to grant it, curious despite herself about the woman who would soon become Nathaniel's wife. Camille arrived the following morning, dressed simply, her usual poise noticeably absent as she was shown into Elena's parlor. She stood near the doorway for a moment, seemingly uncertain of how to begin, before finally taking the seat Elena offered. Thank you for agreeing to see me, Camille said, her voice quieter than Elena expected. I imagine this must feel strange, given everything. It is certainly unexpected, Elena replied honestly. What can I help you with, Miss Ashford? Camille hesitated, twisting her hands together in her lap. I wanted to ask you directly, rather than relying on rumors and whispers. Are the things people are saying about you true? The title, the inheritance, all of it? Every word, Elena confirmed simply. Camille absorbed this for a long moment, her expression difficult to read. And you still intend to attend the wedding? I do, Elena said. I was invited, and I intend to honor that invitation. May I ask why? Camille said, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you willingly return to a family that caused you so much pain? Elena considered the question carefully before answering, recognizing the genuine uncertainty behind it rather than any hidden malice. I am not returning for Nathaniel or for his family, she said finally. I am returning because I have nothing left to fear from either of them. Sometimes closing a door completely requires walking through it one final time, rather than simply avoiding it forever. Camille nodded slowly, though worry remained etched across her features. I am afraid, she admitted quietly. Not of you, but of what this might mean for my own marriage. If Nathaniel invited you specifically to relive some old grievance, what does that say about the man I am about to marry? Elena studied the young woman before her, recognizing genuine fear beneath the careful composure. Fear that likely had nothing to do with jealousy and everything to do with growing doubt about the family she was about to join. That is a question only you can answer, Elena said gently. But I will tell you this much. Whatever happens at that wedding will simply reveal truths that already exist. Truths about the family you are marrying into. Truths that perhaps deserve consideration before you commit yourself entirely to their world. Camille left shortly after, her expression troubled, offering no further explanation for her visit beyond quiet gratitude for Elena's honesty. Elena watched her go, feeling a complicated mixture of sympathy and quiet resolve, understanding that whatever unfolded during the ceremony would ultimately serve a purpose far beyond her own closure. That night, as Elena prepared for sleep, she found herself thinking not of Nathaniel or his mother, but of the quiet strength she had witnessed in Camille's uncertain visit. Perhaps, she thought, the wedding would not simply mark the end of her own chapter with the Cross family, but the beginning of Camille's understanding of exactly what she was choosing to marry into, while there still remained time to reconsider. The wedding was one day away. The church bells rang out across the city, calling guests toward the grand stone cathedral where Nathaniel Cross would soon marry Camille Ashford, and inside its walls, the Cross family had already begun their quiet campaign of cruelty before Elena had even arrived. Margaret Cross stood near the entrance, personally overseeing the seating arrangements with sharp, watchful eyes. When Elena's name appeared on the guest list handed to the ushers, Margaret had made a deliberate decision, instructing that she be seated far from the family's section, tucked near a side pillar where her view of the ceremony would be partially obscured and her presence easy to overlook. It was a small cruelty, precisely calculated, exactly the kind of quiet humiliation the Cross family excelled at delivering without ever raising their voices. Nathaniel, dressed in his wedding finery, paced nervously in the private chamber reserved for the groom, still turning over the rumors that had consumed the city for weeks. Despite everything he had heard, some stubborn part of him refused to believe that Elena, the same woman who had once trembled beneath his mother's disapproving stares, could possibly have transformed into someone capable of intimidating anyone. She probably exaggerated some minor inheritance into grand rumors, he told himself, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror. People do that sort of thing when they have nothing else to offer. His best man, an old friend named Edmund Whitmore, watched him with quiet skepticism. "You seem awfully concerned for someone who claims not to believe the rumors," Edmund observed. "I am not concerned," Nathaniel replied too quickly. "I simply want this day to proceed exactly as planned." Outside the cathedral, guests continued arriving in a steady stream, filling the pews with the city's most prominent families, all eager to witness what promised to be one of the season's most talked-about weddings. Whispers already circulated among the gathering crowd, fueled by weeks of rumors about Elena's mysterious transformation, each guest secretly hoping to witness whatever drama might unfold should she actually appear. Then, precisely as the final guests settled into their seats, a carriage bearing an unfamiliar crest pulled up outside the cathedral steps. The crest was unmistakably elegant, gold and deep green, depicting a stag beneath a crown of oak leaves, the ancient symbol of House Gravenhurst recognized instantly by anyone familiar with the noble families of the region. A hush fell over the small crowd gathered outside the church doors as footmen in formal livery stepped forward to open the carriage door. Elena emerged slowly, composed and radiant in her deep sapphire gown, her posture carrying the quiet authority of someone entirely at ease with the attention now focused upon her. She paused briefly at the base of the steps, allowing herself one calm breath before ascending toward the cathedral entrance, where an usher, unaware of who exactly stood before him, began directing her toward the obscure seat Margaret Cross had arranged. Before he could finish his instructions, another voice interrupted, clear and formal, carrying easily through the hushed entrance hall. "Announcing Elena, Duchess of Gravenhurst." The words came from an older gentleman near the entrance, a distant acquaintance of the Duke's who had recognized Elena immediately and taken it upon himself to ensure her proper introduction. The announcement rippled through the gathered crowd like a stone dropped into still water, conversations halting mid-sentence as heads turned toward the cathedral doors. The usher who had been prepared to seat her near the side pillar froze, his earlier instructions suddenly meaningless in the face of a title that outranked nearly everyone currently seated within the church. Flustered, he quickly redirected her toward the front of the cathedral instead, toward seats reserved for guests of the highest distinction. Inside the main hall, Margaret Cross felt the shift in atmosphere before she fully understood its cause. She turned toward the entrance just in time to see Elena walking calmly up the center aisle, escorted with obvious deference toward a place of honor near the front of the church, guests on either side rising slightly or leaning forward to catch a glimpse of the woman whose name had dominated society gossip for weeks. Margaret's carefully composed expression cracked for just a moment, disbelief and alarm flashing across her features before she managed to smooth her expression back into something resembling calm. "Nathaniel," waiting nervously near the altar as the ceremony's final preparations concluded, caught sight of the commotion through a small gap in the curtains separating the groom's chamber from the main hall. He watched, stunned into silence, as Elena moved through the cathedral with a grace and authority he had never witnessed in her before, guests parting respectfully to allow her passage, whispers of recognition following in her wake. "This cannot be real," he muttered under his breath. Edmund, standing beside him, glanced through the same gap and let out a low whistle. "I believe the rumors may have actually understated things," he said quietly. The ceremony began shortly after, though the atmosphere within the cathedral had shifted noticeably from anticipation to something closer to fascination. Guests found themselves glancing repeatedly toward Elena throughout the proceedings, whispering quietly among themselves, some recalculating years of assumptions about the quiet young woman they remembered from Nathaniel's first marriage. Camille, walking down the aisle toward her waiting groom, could not help but notice the ripple of attention Elena's presence had created throughout the church. She caught sight of the elegant woman seated near the front, composed and untouched by the tension surrounding her, and felt a cold uncertainty settle deeper into her chest, even as she continued walking toward the altar. Throughout the ceremony itself, Elena remained perfectly composed, watching the proceedings with quiet dignity rather than any visible satisfaction or malice. She had not come to disrupt the wedding itself, only to attend as she had been invited, and she maintained that intention throughout the formal exchange of vows, offering no reaction beyond polite, measured attention. It was during the reception that followed, held in the grand ballroom of the Cross family estate, that the true unraveling began. Guests mingled freely throughout the elaborate reception, the orchestra playing softly as servants moved through the crowd with trays of refreshments. Elena remained composed throughout, speaking politely with the handful of genuine acquaintances who approached her, declining most attempts at conversation from society figures whose sudden interest in her friendship felt transparently opportunistic. Margaret Cross, unable to ignore the situation any longer, approached Elena directly during a lull in the festivities, her expression carefully neutral despite the tension evident in her rigid posture. "I must say, the rumors did not do you justice," Margaret said, her tone carrying a thin veneer of civility over obvious discomfort. "Duchess of Gravenhurst, quite an accomplishment for someone who arrived in this family with nothing." Elena regarded her calmly, recognizing the insult woven carefully into what was meant to sound like a compliment. "Thank you," she replied simply, offering nothing further to fuel the older woman's obvious attempt at provocation. Margaret's jaw tightened slightly at Elena's refusal to engage further, and she excused herself shortly after, retreating toward a cluster of family members gathered near the far side of the ballroom, their hushed conversation clearly focused on the unexpected turn their carefully planned celebration had taken. Nathaniel, having avoided direct interaction with Elena throughout the ceremony, finally found himself unable to postpone the confrontation any longer. He approached her during a quiet moment near the edge of the ballroom, his expression carrying a strange mixture of forced confidence and genuine uncertainty. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying an attempt at casual familiarity that felt hollow given the circumstances. "It has been quite some time." "It has," Elena agreed, meeting his gaze steadily without any trace of the nervousness that had once defined her interactions with him. "You look well," he continued, his eyes drifting briefly toward the elegant gown and understated jewelry that marked her clearly as someone of considerable standing. "I understand congratulations are in order. Duchess of Gravenhurst, is it?" "It is," Elena confirmed simply. Nathaniel hesitated, clearly searching for some remark that might reassert the dynamic he had originally intended for this encounter, some comment that might diminish her accomplishment, or remind her of the power he once held over her life. Instead, standing before her composed confidence, he found himself strangely unable to summon the cruelty he had planned for weeks. "I suppose congratulations are in order for you as well," Elena said, breaking the awkward silence between them. "A new marriage, a fresh start. I hope it brings you the happiness you were searching for." Something in her tone, calm and entirely sincere, unsettled Nathaniel more than any anger or bitterness could have. He had expected tears, or fury, or desperate attempts to reclaim his attention. He had not expected genuine indifference, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who had truly moved beyond needing anything from him at all. "Thank you," he managed finally, the words feeling strangely inadequate given everything unspoken between them. Across the room, Camille watched this exchange with growing unease, noting the way Nathaniel's confident posture had subtly deflated during his brief conversation with Elena, the way his eyes kept drifting back toward her throughout the remainder of the reception, searching for something he could not quite name. The evening continued, guests gradually growing more relaxed as the initial shock of Elena's dramatic arrival settled into quieter fascination. Yet beneath the surface of polite celebration, something fundamental had shifted within the room, a quiet recognition among the gathered guests that the woman Nathaniel Cross had once discarded had returned not as a cautionary tale, but as living proof that his judgment, and perhaps his character, deserved far more scrutiny than anyone had previously considered. As the reception wore on, Elena found herself standing near one of the grand windows overlooking the estate gardens, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and violet. She felt no triumph in what had unfolded that evening, only a quiet sense of completion, a recognition that the final chapter of her connection to the Cross family had finally, peacefully closed. She had no way of knowing that the true unraveling of Nathaniel's carefully constructed world had only just begun. Nearby, a small group of guests had gathered around an older woman named Beatrice Langley, a well-respected figure within the city's social circles whose opinion carried considerable weight among the gathered elite. Beatrice had known Elena briefly during her first marriage, remembered her as a quiet, gentle presence who had never quite fit within the sharp edges of the Cross family's world, and now watched with open curiosity as the transformed Duchess moved through the reception with effortless grace. "I remember when that poor girl could barely speak 2 words at these gatherings," Beatrice remarked to her companions, her voice carrying just enough to reach nearby ears. Margaret Cross made certain of that, always finding some new way to remind her she did not belong. "Look at her now. I dare say she belongs in far grander rooms than this one." Her companions murmured in quiet agreement, several exchanging knowing glances that suggested similar memories of Margaret's calculated cruelty toward Elena during those early years. The conversation, though quiet, did not go unnoticed by several members of the Cross family standing within earshot, adding another small crack to the carefully maintained facade of the evening's celebration. Meanwhile, Nathaniel's father, Edmund Cross Sr., a man who had remained largely silent throughout the ceremony, found himself studying Elena from across the ballroom with an expression of quiet reconsideration. He had never fully agreed with his wife's harsh treatment of Nathaniel's first wife, though he had lacked the courage to intervene meaningfully at the time, allowing Margaret's judgment to dictate the family's approach without significant protest. Watching Elena now, composed and dignified despite years of cruelty inflicted upon her by his own family, he felt an uncomfortable weight of regret settling over him. He approached her quietly during a lull in the evening's festivities, his manner considerably more humble than his wife's earlier attempt at conversation. "Duchess Gravenhurst," he said, offering a respectful bow, "I want you to know, whatever else might be said this evening, that I never believed you deserved the treatment my family showed you during your marriage to my son." Elena studied him for a moment, recognizing genuine sincerity in his tired eyes. "Thank you for saying so," she replied gently, "though I suspect silence, however well-intentioned, still carries its own weight." Edmund Sr. nodded slowly, accepting the quiet rebuke without argument. "You are right, of course," he admitted. "I have carried that regret for many years now. I am glad to see it did not prevent you from building the life you clearly deserved." Their brief exchange, though private, was observed by several guests nearby, adding yet another layer to the evening's growing narrative. By now, small clusters of conversation had formed throughout the ballroom, each one dissecting some new detail of Elena's transformation, some fresh memory of the Cross family's past treatment of her, weaving together a picture that grew less flattering to Nathaniel and his mother with every passing hour. Sophie, who had accompanied Elena to the reception despite not being formally invited, watched the shifting atmosphere of the room with quiet satisfaction. She found Elena near the garden windows and gently touched her arm. "You do not need to stay much longer. If you would rather leave," Sophie said quietly, "you have already accomplished everything you came here to do, simply by existing in this room as yourself." Elena glanced around the ballroom, taking in the scene one final time, the whispered conversations, the uncertain glances from Nathaniel's family, the quiet dignity she had maintained throughout an evening designed originally for her humiliation. "Perhaps you are right," she agreed softly. "I believe I have seen everything I needed to see tonight." As Elena prepared to make her exit, gathering her wrap and exchanging quiet farewells with the few genuine friends who had approached her throughout the evening, she caught one final glimpse of Nathaniel, standing near the head table, his expression distant and troubled despite the celebration surrounding him. Beside him, Camille sat quietly, her earlier uncertainty now fully bloomed into visible unease as she watched her new husband's attention repeatedly drift toward the woman he had once discarded. Elena felt no satisfaction in the discomfort so clearly written across their faces. She felt only the quiet certainty that whatever unfolded from this point forward belonged entirely to them, shaped by choices they alone had made, consequences they alone would need to face. She departed the reception quietly, without fanfare, her carriage pulling away from the Cross estate exactly as the orchestra began a new song, the celebration continuing behind her, without any true resolution to the tension her presence had introduced into every corner of that grand ballroom. The morning after his wedding, Nathaniel Cross woke to a silence in his own home that felt heavier than any argument could have been. Camille had already risen, seated at the small breakfast table by the window, her untouched tea growing cold in front of her while she stared out at the garden without truly seeing it. "Good morning," Nathaniel said carefully, taking his seat across from her. Camille did not respond immediately, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup in slow, distracted circles. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but unmistakably firm. "I want to know everything," she said. "About Elena, about why you invited her yesterday, about what really happened between you and her all those years ago." Nathaniel felt his stomach tighten. "We discussed this before the wedding," he said, attempting a casual tone that did not match the tension in his shoulders. "She is simply part of my past, nothing more." "Then explain to me why half the guests at our wedding spent the entire reception whispering about her instead of celebrating our marriage," Camille said, her composure finally cracking beneath weeks of mounting unease. "Explain why your own father approached her privately to apologize for something your family apparently did to her. Explain why you could not stop watching her throughout the entire evening, even while standing beside me at our own wedding." Nathaniel opened his mouth to respond, but no adequate explanation came to him. The truth, one he had avoided confronting even in his own private thoughts, sat heavily between them, impossible to disguise any longer. "I invited her because I wanted her to see what she lost," he admitted finally, the words feeling strange and hollow now that they existed outside his own head. "I wanted her to watch me build a new life, a better life, without her in it. I wanted her to understand exactly what she gave up when our marriage ended." Camille stared at him, something between disbelief and disgust crossing her features. "You invited your former wife to our wedding out of cruelty," she said slowly, as though testing whether she had truly understood him correctly. "I did not think it would matter this much," Nathaniel said weakly, aware even as he spoke that the excuse sounded insufficient even to himself. "It matters because it reveals exactly what kind of man I married," Camille said, rising from the table with sudden controlled anger. "You spent years building resentment toward a woman who apparently did nothing to deserve it, and rather than simply moving forward with your life, you orchestrated an elaborate humiliation at what should have been the happiest day of my life. That is not the man I believed I was marrying." She left the breakfast room without another word, leaving Nathaniel alone with the weight of a truth he could no longer avoid. Word of the growing tension within the newlywed household spread quickly through the city's social circles, fueled by servants' gossip and the observant eyes of guests who had witnessed the strange dynamics of the wedding reception firsthand. Within days, the story had transformed from simple curiosity about Elena's mysterious title into something far more damaging to Nathaniel's reputation, a narrative that painted him not as a man who had moved on from a failed marriage, but as someone who had deliberately orchestrated cruelty toward a woman who had done nothing to deserve it. Beatrice Langley, whose earlier comments at the reception had already begun circulating through social gatherings, found herself increasingly vocal about her recollections of Nathaniel's treatment of Elena during their marriage. At a tea gathering hosted by one of the city's most prominent hostesses, she recounted several instances of Margaret Cross's public humiliation of Elena, painting a picture of systematic cruelty that many guests had witnessed firsthand but rarely discussed openly. "I always suspected there was more unkindness in that marriage than anyone cared to admit," Beatrice said to the gathered women, her tone carrying the particular authority of someone whose observations had proven accurate. "Seeing how gracefully she carried herself at that wedding, despite everything, only confirms what I always believed about her character, and what I always suspected about theirs." Similar conversations echoed throughout drawing rooms and social clubs across the city over the following weeks, each retelling adding new details, some accurate, some exaggerated, all contributing to a rapidly shifting perception of Nathaniel Cross among the very social circles he had once dominated so effortlessly. His business associates, who had previously valued his family connections and social standing, began quietly distancing themselves from partnerships and negotiations that had once seemed guaranteed. A prominent merchant named Charles Pemberton, who had been on the verge of finalizing a significant business arrangement with Nathaniel before the wedding, suddenly found reasons to delay their negotiations indefinitely, citing vague concerns about timing that both men understood were simply polite excuses for a decision rooted in reputation, rather than business logic. Nathaniel found himself increasingly isolated, his usual circle of friends and associates growing noticeably distant, invitations to social gatherings arriving with less frequency than before, conversations at his own club growing quieter and more guarded whenever he entered the room. His mother, meanwhile, faced her own reckoning within society circles that had once deferred to her judgment without question. Margaret Cross had built her reputation on maintaining rigid standards of propriety and family honor, standards that now appeared deeply hypocritical in light of the stories circulating about her treatment of Elena during the years of her son's first marriage. At a charity function she had organized for over a decade, Margaret found herself facing pointed questions from fellow committee members about her role in Elena's departure from the family. Questions delivered with polite but unmistakable skepticism that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. "I simply do not understand how you could treat a family member with such coldness," one committee member remarked during a planning meeting, her tone carrying just enough edge to make her disapproval clear, especially one who apparently possessed such remarkable character and resilience. Margaret, unaccustomed to having her judgment questioned so openly, found herself struggling to maintain her usual composure. "The family had valid concerns at the time," she said stiffly, though even she seemed to recognize how weak the explanation sounded, given everything now known about Elena's subsequent accomplishments. The committee member said nothing further, but her expression left little doubt about her true opinion, an opinion increasingly shared throughout the social circles that had once considered Margaret Cross an unquestionable authority on matters of family honor and propriety. Nearly 3 weeks after the wedding, Nathaniel finally reached a breaking point. He had spent the intervening weeks watching his carefully constructed reputation crumble piece by piece, his marriage growing increasingly strained under the weight of unresolved resentment, his business relationships deteriorating under the pressure of social scrutiny he had never anticipated facing. He arrived unannounced at Elena's townhouse one evening, his composed exterior finally cracking under the accumulated pressure of the preceding weeks. Sophie answered the door, her expression shifting to wariness the moment she recognized him standing on the doorstep. "I need to speak with Elena," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying none of the confident arrogance she remembered from his earlier visit to the wedding. Sophie hesitated, glancing back toward the parlor where Elena sat reading by the fire. After a moment she stepped aside, allowing him entry, though her expression made clear she would be remaining close by throughout whatever conversation followed. Elena looked up as Nathaniel entered the parlor, her expression calm despite the unexpected visit. "This is a surprise," she said simply, setting aside her book. "I need to understand something," Nathaniel said, remaining standing near the doorway, his posture noticeably less confident than during their previous encounter. "Did you plan this? Did you orchestrate everything that has happened since the wedding, deliberately trying to destroy my reputation and my marriage?" Elena studied him for a long moment before responding, recognizing genuine desperation beneath his accusatory tone. "I did nothing beyond attending a wedding I was invited to," she said calmly. "I did not spread rumors about your family's treatment of me. I did not encourage your business associates to reconsider their partnerships. I did not create tension between you and your new wife. Everything that has unfolded since that day has been the result of choices made by you and your family, not by me." "That cannot be entirely true," Nathaniel insisted, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "People do not simply turn against someone without reason." "Perhaps they turned against you because they finally saw clearly what was always there," Elena said gently. "I spent 6 years of my life believing I deserved the treatment your family gave me, believing that my lack of wealth and status somehow justified their cruelty. It took years of rebuilding my life entirely on my own to understand that none of that was ever true. Perhaps the people now reconsidering their opinion of you and your family are simply arriving at that same understanding, without needing years to do so." Nathaniel sank into a nearby chair, his earlier composure completely abandoned, replaced by something closer to genuine grief. "My marriage is falling apart," he admitted quietly. "Camille barely speaks to me. My business partners are distancing themselves. My own mother's reputation is suffering because of decisions she made years ago, decisions I never fully understood the weight of until now." Elena felt an unexpected flicker of sympathy, though it did not extend into any desire to offer him comfort or reassurance. "I am sorry you are struggling," she said honestly. "But I did not create these circumstances. I simply stopped hiding, stopped disappearing quietly the way your family always expected me to. The consequences you are facing now were always possible outcomes of the choices you made years ago. They simply took time to arrive." Nathaniel sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of her words settling heavily around him. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked finally, his voice small and uncertain. "To repair any of this?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering. "That is not something I can answer for you," she said. "Your marriage, your reputation, your relationship with your own family, all of these are things only you can work to repair, if repair is even possible at this point. I have already rebuilt my own life without needing anything from you or your family. I do not intend to become responsible for rebuilding yours as well." Nathaniel left shortly after, his shoulders visibly heavier than when he had arrived, walking out into the evening without the confident stride that had once defined his presence in any room he entered. Sophie returned to the parlor once he had gone, studying Elena's expression carefully. "How do you feel?" she asked gently. Elena considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Strangely peaceful," she admitted. "I expected to feel something more dramatic, watching everything unravel for him the way it did. Instead, I simply feel like a chapter has finally closed, without any lingering weight attached to it." "That sounds like exactly what closure is supposed to feel like," Sophie said softly. "Perhaps it is," Elena agreed, picking her book back up and settling once more into her chair, the fire crackling softly beside her as the evening settled into quiet, comfortable silence. Outside, the city continued its endless flow of gossip and speculation, the story of Nathaniel Cross's unraveling marriage and reputation spreading further with each passing day, while Elena, Duchess of Gravenhurst, remained exactly where she belonged, entirely at peace with the life she had built, untouched by the consequences now unfolding for the man who had once tried to break her. A few days later, Camille arrived unannounced at Elena's townhouse, much as Nathaniel had done before her, though her manner carried none of his desperate energy. She stood at the doorway looking pale but composed, and asked quietly if she might have a few minutes of Elena's time. Elena welcomed her into the parlor, offering tea that Camille accepted more out of politeness than genuine interest. For a while, neither woman spoke, the silence between them heavy with everything that had unfolded since the wedding. "I owe you an apology," Camille said finally, breaking the silence. "Not for anything I did directly, but for not understanding sooner what kind of family I was marrying into. I think some part of me suspected there was more to the story than Nathaniel ever told me, but I chose not to ask the difficult questions until it was already too late." "You do not owe me an apology," Elena said gently. "You were not responsible for decisions made years before you ever entered his life." "Perhaps not," Camille said, turning her teacup slowly in her hands. "But I am responsible for what I choose to do now, knowing what I know. I have decided to end the marriage." Elena studied the young woman before her, recognizing the quiet resolve beneath her evident sadness. "That cannot be an easy decision," she said honestly. "It is not," Camille admitted. "But staying would mean accepting a version of my life built on cruelty I never fully understood until now. I would rather face difficulty and uncertainty than remain married to a man who used our wedding day as an instrument of someone else's humiliation." Elena felt a quiet admiration for the young woman's courage, recognizing echoes of her own journey in Camille's decision. "It takes considerable strength to walk away from a life that others might consider secure and comfortable," she said. "I understand that difficulty better than most." "I know you do," Camille said, meeting Elena's eyes directly for the first time since arriving. "That is partly why I wanted to speak with you before making my decision final. I wanted you to know that whatever happened at the wedding, whatever consequences Nathaniel is now facing, none of it was your doing. You simply existed as yourself, and that alone was enough to reveal truths that needed revealing." The two women spoke for a while longer, their conversation growing gradually warmer despite the difficult circumstances that had brought them together. By the time Camille finally departed, something had shifted between them, an unexpected understanding forged from shared experience with the same family's cruelty, though separated by years and circumstance. News of Camille's decision to seek an annulment spread through society within days, adding yet another devastating blow to Nathaniel's rapidly diminishing reputation. What had once seemed like an advantageous marriage now appeared, in the eyes of society, as further confirmation of poor judgment and questionable character. A young bride abandoning her new husband within weeks of the ceremony, citing reasons that everyone now understood involved his cruel treatment of his former wife. Margaret Cross, watching her son's world collapse around him with each passing week, found herself forced to confront the consequences of choices she had made years earlier. Choices she had never expected to resurface with such devastating consequences. She arrived at Elena's townhouse once more, though this visit carried none of the careful control that had marked her earlier appearance. "I do not understand how everything has fallen apart so quickly," Margaret said, seated stiffly in Elena's parlor, her usual composure completely absent. Nathaniel's business partnerships have collapsed entirely. His marriage has ended before it truly began. Our family's standing within society has suffered damage I am not certain we can ever fully repair. Elena listened without interruption, recognizing that Margaret had not come seeking comfort or reassurance, but simply needed somewhere to express the weight of consequences she had never anticipated facing. I never wanted any of this, Margaret continued, her voice uncharacteristically small. I only ever wanted to protect my family's reputation, to ensure Nathaniel married someone who would strengthen our standing, rather than diminish it. I never imagined those choices would eventually lead to this. Perhaps, Elena said gently, protecting a family's reputation should never require destroying someone else's sense of worth in the process. I was not a threat to your family, Margaret. I was simply someone who loved your son, who tried desperately to belong within a world that had already decided I never could. Margaret said nothing for a long moment, staring down at her own hands, clearly grappling with years of assumptions now crumbling beneath the weight of undeniable truth. I am sorry, she said finally, the words clearly unfamiliar and difficult for her to speak aloud. Not simply for how things have unfolded now, but for how I treated you then. I convinced myself it was necessary, protecting the family, upholding standards that mattered more to me than they should have. Elena studied the older woman before her, recognizing genuine remorse beneath years of carefully constructed pride. Thank you for saying that, she said honestly. It does not undo what happened, but I believe it matters, nonetheless. Margaret left shortly after, her posture noticeably different from the confident woman who had first arrived at Elena's townhouse weeks earlier, replaced by someone visibly humbled by consequences she had never anticipated facing. That evening, Elena sat alone in her study, reflecting on everything that had unfolded since receiving that gilded invitation weeks earlier. She felt no satisfaction in Nathaniel's suffering, no triumph in his mother's humbled apology, only a quiet recognition that truth, once given space to exist without interference, had a way of settling matters far more effectively than any deliberate act of revenge ever could. She thought of Camille, beginning her own difficult journey toward rebuilding a life she had not expected to need rebuilding so soon. She thought of Nathaniel, facing consequences that had taken years to arrive but had finally caught up with him regardless. She thought of Margaret, confronting the weight of choices she had convinced herself were justified for far too long. And she thought of herself, Elena, Duchess of Gravenhurst, who had walked into that wedding not seeking revenge, but simply seeking to exist honestly, within a world that had once tried desperately to convince her she did not belong. She had never needed to destroy anyone to prove her own worth. She had simply needed to stop hiding it. 6 weeks after the wedding that had shattered nearly everything Nathaniel Cross once believed about his own life, he stood alone in the empty drawing room of his townhouse, staring at wedding gifts that still sat wrapped and untouched in the corner, remnants of a marriage that had ended before it truly began. Camille's belongings had been removed the previous week, her departure handled with quiet dignity that only seemed to highlight the contrast between her graceful exit and the messy collapse of everything else surrounding him. His business partnerships remained in disarray, several key associates having formally withdrawn from agreements that had once seemed guaranteed. His social invitations had dwindled to almost nothing, the same drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs that once eagerly welcomed him, now offering only polite, distant acknowledgement whenever he happened to appear. He had spent these weeks attempting to understand exactly how his life had unraveled so completely, how a single wedding invitation, intended as a final act of quiet cruelty, had instead become the catalyst for his own downfall. Yet the more he reflected on everything that had happened, the more he understood that the unraveling had not truly begun with Elena's arrival at his wedding. It had begun years earlier, the moment he chose convenience and his family's approval over the woman who had genuinely loved him, the moment he abandoned Elena without a second thought, confident that her lack of status and connections meant her opinion of him would never matter again. He had been wrong about that, though not in the way he originally feared. Elena's success had not destroyed him through malice or deliberate revenge. It had simply exposed, through its quiet existence, exactly how little his own choices and character could withstand honest scrutiny. His mother visited less frequently now, her own reputation still recovering from the damage inflicted by revelations about her past treatment of Elena. Their relationship, once defined by his eager compliance with her expectations, had grown noticeably more distant, weighted by unspoken resentment on both sides about choices neither could fully undo. His father, surprisingly, had grown closer to him during these difficult weeks, offering quiet support without judgment, though even that support carried an undercurrent of disappointment that Nathaniel found difficult to bear. You have time to rebuild something meaningful from all of this, his father told him one evening, if you are willing to become someone genuinely different from who you have been. Nathaniel was not yet certain he knew how to become that person, but for the first time in his life, he found himself genuinely considering the question, rather than dismissing it entirely. Meanwhile, across the city, Elena prepared to return to Gravenhurst. Her business in the city finally concluded. The final chapter of her connection to Nathaniel Cross closed as completely as she had hoped it would be. Sophie helped her pack the last of her belongings, the two women moving through the townhouse with the easy efficiency of long practice. "Do you think you will ever see him again?" Sophie asked, folding a shawl carefully into one of the traveling cases. Elena considered the question thoughtfully. "Perhaps, at some distant social gathering or business matter that happens to intersect our paths," she said. "But I do not think it will carry the same weight it once did. Whatever power he held over my sense of worth disappeared a long time ago. What happened at his wedding simply made that truth visible to everyone else as well." Sophie smiled softly, closing the case with a firm click. "You never needed his downfall to prove your own worth," she observed. "Yet somehow, that is exactly what happened." "That was never my intention," Elena said honestly. "I did not attend that wedding hoping to destroy his marriage or his reputation. I attended simply because I refused to let fear or shame keep me from stepping into a room I had every right to enter, exactly as myself. Whatever consequences followed for him were entirely his own doing, built from years of choices that eventually caught up with him." The following morning, Elena departed the city for the final time, her carriage bearing the Gravenhurst crest rolling steadily through familiar streets one last time, before turning onto the road leading north toward the estate she now called home. She watched the city gradually fade behind her, feeling not sadness, but a quiet sense of completion, of a chapter finally, truly closed. The journey back to Gravenhurst took the better part of 2 days, and Elena spent much of that time reflecting on everything that had unfolded since receiving that fateful invitation weeks earlier. She thought of the frightened, uncertain woman she had once been, discarded and humiliated, believing herself unworthy of the life she had originally hoped to build with Nathaniel. She thought of the long, difficult years that had followed, the quiet determination that had slowly transformed her into someone capable of walking into that cathedral with genuine confidence, untouched by the cruelty that had once defined so much of her existence. She arrived at Gravenhurst on a clear autumn afternoon, the estate's familiar fields stretching out beneath a brilliant blue sky, workers moving steadily through the final stages of harvest, the same steady rhythm of life that had welcomed her home countless times before. The staff greeted her warmly, genuine happiness evident in their expressions, as they helped unload her carriage, and welcomed her back to the place she had built into something entirely her own. Old Mr. Findlay, tending his garden near the estate's eastern boundary, waved cheerfully as her carriage passed, calling out a warm greeting that carried none of the cautious formalities she had once encountered from strangers in the city. "Welcome home, Your Grace," he called, his weathered face creasing into a genuine smile. Elena smiled back, feeling the familiar warmth of true belonging settle over her, a feeling she had never quite managed to find during her years with Nathaniel and his family. Despite years of desperate effort, it had taken losing everything, and rebuilding it entirely on her own terms, to finally understand what genuine belonging actually felt like. That evening, standing once more on the hill overlooking the estate where the Duke had first taught her that responsibility mattered more than blood, Elena watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, the fields below settling into peaceful evening stillness. She thought of everything that had happened over the preceding weeks, the wedding, the confrontations, the quiet unraveling of everything Nathaniel had once taken for granted. She felt no lingering anger, no desire for further vindication. She had simply wanted to close a door that had remained open far too long, to walk through the wreckage of her old life one final time, not as a victim seeking validation, but as a woman who had built something extraordinary, entirely through her own strength and determination. Word continued to reach her occasionally over the following months, carried through letters from Lucy and occasional mentions in correspondence from acquaintances still living within the city. Nathaniel's business ventures continued struggling under the weight of damaged relationships and lost trust. Several partnerships he had once relied upon never fully recovering from the scrutiny his character had faced. His mother, humbled by the very public consequences of choices she had once considered entirely justified, gradually retreated from many of her former social commitments, her influence within society circles noticeably diminished from what it had once been. Camille, meanwhile, had begun quietly rebuilding her own life, moving to a smaller residence outside the city with the support of her own family, gradually distancing herself from the scandal that had briefly consumed her name. Elena occasionally received brief, warm letters from her, updates on her slow but steady progress toward independence and genuine happiness, each letter carrying a quiet gratitude for the honesty Elena had offered her during that brief but significant meeting weeks before the annulment. Elena responded to each letter with genuine warmth, recognizing in Camille's journey echoes of her own path years earlier, understanding intimately the difficult but ultimately liberating process of rebuilding a life interrupted by someone else's cruelty and poor judgment. As the months passed, Elena settled fully back into the rhythm of life at Gravenhurst, her days filled with the familiar responsibilities of managing the estate, caring for the tenants who depended on her fair judgment, maintaining the legacy the Duke had entrusted to her all those years earlier. The wedding, once a source of considerable anxiety and complicated emotion, gradually faded into simply another chapter of her past, significant but no longer defining, a single moment within a much larger story of resilience and quiet triumph. She often thought back to that rainy morning when the gilded invitation had first arrived, the fear and uncertainty it had initially stirred within her, the difficult decision to attend rather than retreat into safety and avoidance. She recognized now, with the clarity that only distance and time could provide, that the true victory had never depended on Nathaniel's downfall or his family's humiliation. The true victory had simply been her willingness to show up as herself, entirely unafraid, carrying nothing but the truth of everything she had built since the day he abandoned her. On a quiet evening nearly a year after the wedding, Elena sat in her study reviewing correspondence from a neighboring estate regarding a potential agricultural partnership, the familiar rhythm of estate business filling her days with purpose and satisfaction she had once believed impossible to find. Sophie entered quietly, carrying a fresh pot of tea, settling into the chair across from Elena's desk with the easy comfort of years of genuine friendship. "Do you ever think about that day?" Sophie asked, pouring 2 cups of tea. "The wedding, I mean." "All of it." Elena considered the question thoughtfully before answering, setting aside the correspondence she had been reviewing. "Sometimes," she admitted, "though it feels increasingly like a memory belonging to someone else's life now, rather than my own." "That seems like a healthy way to carry it," Sophie observed. Elena smiled softly, accepting the cup Sophie offered. "I think the greatest gift that entire experience gave me was proof that I no longer needed anyone's approval to know my own worth," she said. "Not Nathaniel's, not his family's, not society's. I had already built that certainty for myself, long before I ever walked into that cathedral." Sophie raised her teacup slightly, a small, warm smile touching her lips. "To Elena, Duchess of Gravenhurst," she said, "who never needed a crown to know she deserved one." Elena laughed softly, raising her own cup in response, the warm evening light filling the study as the estate outside settled into peaceful, familiar stillness, exactly the kind of quiet, hard-earned happiness she had spent 6 long years learning to build entirely for herself. She had walked into that wedding carrying nothing but her own truth. She had walked out carrying something far greater. She had walked out finally, completely free. A few weeks later, an unexpected letter arrived at Gravenhurst, its handwriting immediately recognizable despite the years that had passed since Elena had last seen it. Nathaniel had written to her, not seeking reconciliation or forgiveness, but simply to share news he seemed to feel she deserved to know. He had sold his remaining business interests in the city and relocated to a smaller town along the coast, choosing to build something modest and honest, rather than continuing to chase the status and approval that had once defined every choice he made. "I do not expect you to respond to this letter," he had written. "I only wanted you to know that watching everything unravel taught me more about myself than any comfortable success ever could. I am trying, slowly, to become someone worth respecting, not for society's sake, but for my own. I imagine you built that same understanding for yourself long before I ever managed to." Elena read the letter twice, feeling neither anger nor renewed sympathy, only a quiet, distant acknowledgement of a man finally beginning a journey she had already completed years earlier. She did not respond, choosing instead to fold the letter carefully and place it among old correspondence she rarely revisited, a final, quiet acknowledgement that this particular story had truly reached its end. Spring arrived at Gravenhurst not long after, bringing with it the familiar rhythm of planting season, tenants moving through fields with renewed energy, the estate humming with the steady productivity that had become the foundation of Elena's life. She spent her mornings walking the grounds alongside her steward, reviewing plans for the coming season, discussing improvements to irrigation systems that would benefit tenant families for generations to come. Lucy visited that spring, staying for nearly 2 weeks, filling the halls of Gravenhurst with laughter and lively conversation that reminded Elena how fortunate she remained in the genuine friendships that had carried her through the most difficult years of her life. The two women spent long afternoons walking the estate gardens, discussing everything from estate business to lighter matters of fashion and society gossip that no longer carried any real weight for Elena, simply pleasant entertainment shared between old friends. "You seem different since the wedding," Lucy observed one afternoon, as they sat together beneath the shade of an old oak tree near the eastern gardens. "Lighter, somehow, even though so much has happened." "I think I finally stopped carrying weight that was never truly mine to carry," Elena said thoughtfully. "For years, some quiet part of me still measured my worth against what Nathaniel and his family once thought of me. Walking into that wedding, facing them honestly, finally let go of that weight completely." Lucy smiled warmly, reaching over to squeeze her friend's hand. "I am glad," she said simply. "You deserve every bit of the peace you have built here." As the seasons continued their steady turn, Elena's life at Gravenhurst grew richer and more settled with each passing year. She expanded the estate's charitable efforts, establishing a small school for tenant children that provided education previously unavailable to families working the land, a project born from her own memories of how much a chance at opportunity had once meant to her. She became known throughout the region not simply as a duchess who had inherited an impressive title, but as a fair, thoughtful leader whose judgment neighboring landowners increasingly sought during matters of dispute or difficulty. The story of the wedding gradually faded from society's active gossip, replaced eventually by newer scandals and fresher intrigue, though it remained, for those who had witnessed it firsthand, a memorable example of how quietly and completely truth could dismantle carefully constructed cruelty when finally given room to exist without interference. Elena rarely thought of that evening now beyond occasional quiet reflection, content instead in the steady, meaningful rhythm of the life she had built entirely through her own resilience and determination. She had faced the family that once tried to convince her she was worthless, and had emerged not through revenge or bitterness, but through the simple, powerful act of existing honestly as exactly who she had become. She had needed no crown to know her own worth. She had simply needed the courage to stop hiding it. And in the quiet, golden fields of Gravenhurst, surrounded by people who valued her not for any title she carried, but for the fairness and strength she brought to every decision, Elena finally understood that this, more than any title or triumph over those who had wronged her, was the truest measure of everything she had built. This was home. This was hers, and nothing Nathaniel Cross or his family had ever done could take it from her again. 3 years after the wedding that had changed the course of so many lives, Elena stood at the edge of a newly built schoolhouse on the Gravenhurst estate, watching a group of tenant children file inside for their morning lessons, their laughter carrying across the crisp autumn air. The school had grown considerably since its modest beginning, now employing 2 full-time teachers and serving nearly 40 children from families across the estate and neighboring lands. She had funded much of the project from her own personal income rather than drawing on the estate's general funds, wanting the initiative to remain entirely separate from any question of obligation or expectation. It had become, over the years, one of the achievements she took the quietest but deepest pride in, knowing firsthand how much a single opportunity could change the entire trajectory of someone's life. Mr. Findley's granddaughter, now a bright young woman of 17, had become one of the school's first graduates to pursue further education, currently studying under a respected tutor in the nearby town, with hopes of eventually becoming a physician, an aspiration nearly unthinkable for a woman of her background just a generation earlier. Elena had personally arranged and funded the arrangement, seeing in the young woman's determination echoes of her own long journey toward a life she had once believed impossible. That afternoon, as Elena reviewed estate correspondence in her study, Sophie entered with a letter bearing an unfamiliar seal, her expression curious. "This arrived by special courier," Sophie said, handing over the envelope. "Whoever sent it clearly wanted to ensure it reached you quickly." Elena opened the letter carefully, recognizing after a moment the name of a distant relative of the late Duke, a young man named Oliver Hartley who had visited Gravenhurst briefly the previous year to discuss matters related to a small parcel of disputed land along the estate's northern boundary. The letter explained that Oliver had recently been appointed to a position within the regional council overseeing agricultural policy, and hoped Elena might consider joining a newly formed advisory board focused on improving conditions for tenant farmers across the wider region. "Your reputation for fairness and innovation at Gravenhurst has become something of a model others wish to learn from," the letter explained. I believe your voice on this board would carry considerable weight and could genuinely improve conditions for countless families beyond our own estate borders. Elena read the letter twice, feeling a familiar flicker of purpose stirring within her, the same quiet determination that had once carried her through the difficult early years of managing Gravenhurst alone. She had built something meaningful within the borders of her own estate. Perhaps it was time to consider what that same determination might accomplish on a larger scale. She discussed the opportunity with Sophie that evening over dinner, weighing the considerable additional responsibility against the potential impact such a position might allow her to have. It would mean more time away from Gravenhurst, Elena said thoughtfully, more travel, more negotiation with people who may not initially respect a woman's judgment on agricultural matters regardless of her success here. You have faced skepticism before and proven it wrong every time, Sophie pointed out. I do not think this would be any different. Elena smiled, appreciating her friend's unwavering confidence. Perhaps you are right, she said. I believe I will accept the position. Over the following months, Elena began dividing her time between managing Gravenhurst and traveling to regional council meetings, where she quickly established herself as a thoughtful, formidable voice on matters of tenant welfare and agricultural policy. Her first-hand experience managing a large estate, combined with her genuine understanding of the challenges facing working families, gave her insights that many of her fellow council members, most of whom had inherited their positions rather than earned them through hands-on experience, simply could not match. Word of her growing influence within regional politics eventually reached the city once more, carried through occasional newspaper mentions and society gossip that had long since lost its bite where Elena was concerned. She read one such mention with mild amusement one evening, an article describing her as one of the most respected voices in agricultural reform currently working within the region, a description that would have seemed impossibly distant to the frightened young woman who had once arrived at Gravenhurst with nothing but a single suitcase. That same evening another letter arrived, this one from Camille, now happily remarried to a kind and steady gentleman named Frederick Barlow, a quiet scholar who ran a small but respected publishing house in a coastal town far from the social circles that had once caused her so much distress. The letter was warm and genuinely happy, filled with news of a recently born daughter and Camille's growing involvement in local charitable work, supporting women rebuilding their lives after difficult marriages. I often think of that conversation we shared before everything fell apart, Camille wrote. Your honesty that day gave me courage I did not know I possessed. I hope you know how much that gift has meant to me in the years since. Elena smiled as she read the letter, feeling genuine warmth at the knowledge that Camille had found true happiness after the difficult beginning of her adult life. She wrote back promptly, sharing news of her own continued work at Gravenhurst and her new position on the regional council, the correspondence between them having grown, over the years, into a genuine and unexpected friendship built from shared understanding rather than any lingering connection to Nathaniel. Nathaniel himself remained largely absent from Elena's thoughts these days, his occasional letters growing less frequent over the years as he settled fully into his quieter life along the coast. She heard, through mutual acquaintances rather than any direct correspondence, that he had eventually remarried as well, choosing this time a woman entirely outside the social circles that had once defined his ambitions, someone he had met while working an honest trade far removed from the wealth and status he had once pursued so single-mindedly. She felt genuine, if distant, satisfaction at the news, hoping sincerely that he had truly found the growth and understanding his earlier letter had suggested he was seeking. As winter settled over Gravenhurst that year, Elena stood once more on the familiar hill overlooking the estate, watching snow begin to dust the distant fields in soft white layers. She thought of everything that had unfolded since that rainy morning years earlier, when a gilded invitation had first arrived at her door, threatening to reopen wounds she had worked so hard to heal. She thought of the woman she had been then, uncertain but determined, choosing courage over safety, honesty over avoidance. She thought of everything that decision had ultimately set into motion, not simply for herself, but for Camille, for Nathaniel, for his family, for countless tenant families whose lives had been quietly improved through the platform her growing reputation had eventually provided her. She had never sought to become an example for others. She had simply wanted to exist honestly within a world that had once tried to convince her she deserved to disappear quietly. Yet somehow, through nothing more than that simple, steady honesty, she had built something far greater than she ever could have imagined during those difficult early years of rebuilding her shattered life. Sophie joined her on the hill as the light began to fade, wrapping a warm shawl around her own shoulders against the growing evening chill. Lost in thought again, Sophie observed gently. Just grateful, Elena replied. watching the last golden light settle over the snow-covered fields below. For everything this life has become, and everything it continues to teach me. The two women stood together in comfortable silence as evening fully settled over Gravenhurst, the estate glowing softly with lamplight in the growing darkness, a quiet testament to everything Elena had built from the wreckage of a life that had once seemed completely destroyed. She had walked into that wedding years earlier carrying nothing but her own truth. She had spent every year since discovering exactly how far that truth could carry her. And as she turned finally to walk back toward the warmth of her home, Elena understood with complete certainty that whatever chapters still remained ahead of her, she would face them exactly as she had faced everything since that rainy Tuesday morning years before. Entirely, unshakably herself. The following spring brought with it an invitation Elena never expected to receive, a formal request from the regional council asking her to deliver an address at their annual gathering, sharing her insights on tenant welfare and estate management before an audience of landowners and policymakers from across the wider region. It was, she understood, a significant honor, one rarely extended to someone who had entered these circles through inheritance rather than birthright, and certainly rarely extended to a woman. She spent several weeks preparing her remarks carefully, drawing on years of hard-won experience managing Gravenhurst, on lessons learned from tenants and staff, who had taught her as much about leadership as the Duke himself ever had. She wanted her words to carry genuine substance, not simply politeness or vague sentiment, but real, actionable insight that might actually improve conditions for families working land across the region. The day of the gathering arrived cold and bright, the grand hall where the council met filled with rows of distinguished guests, many of whom Elena recognized from her years serving on the advisory board, others entirely unfamiliar faces representing estates and interests from distant corners of the region. She felt a familiar flutter of nerves as she approached the podium, though it settled quickly into the same steady calm that had carried her through far more difficult moments than this one. She spoke plainly and honestly about the challenges facing tenant families, about practical solutions she had implemented at Gravenhurst that had genuinely improved harvest yields and living conditions without requiring excessive expense from struggling estates. She spoke of the small school she had built, of the tangible difference education had already made in the lives of children who might otherwise have faced the same limited opportunities their parents had known. By the time she concluded her remarks, the hall had fallen into a thoughtful, attentive silence, followed by genuine, sustained applause that surprised her with its warmth. Several landowners approached her afterward, eager to discuss implementing similar programs on their own estates, genuinely curious about the practical details behind her success rather than simply offering polite, empty compliments. Among those who approached her that afternoon was an older gentleman named Charles Ainsworth, a widower who managed a modest but well-respected estate several counties away. He introduced himself with quiet warmth, praising her address with genuine sincerity rather than flattery, and the two fell into easy conversation about estate management that continued long after most other guests had departed the gathering. Over the following months, their correspondence continued, initially focused on practical matters of agricultural policy, gradually growing warmer and more personal as genuine friendship developed between them. Elena found herself looking forward to his letters, with an anticipation she had not experienced since her earliest, most hopeful days with Nathaniel, though this feeling carried none of the desperate uncertainty that had once defined that earlier chapter of her life. She approached this budding connection with the same careful, deliberate thoughtfulness that had guided every significant decision since rebuilding her life at Gravenhurst, neither rushing toward attachment nor closing herself off from the possibility of genuine companionship simply out of old fear. Sophie, observing the growing warmth in Elena's letters and the lightness in her friend's demeanor whenever Charles's name arose in conversation, could not resist gently teasing her about it one evening over dinner. "You seem to smile rather often these days when his letters arrive," Sophie observed, a knowing grin spreading across her face. Elena laughed softly, unable to deny the observation. "He is a genuinely good man," she said, "kind, thoughtful, entirely without pretension. I find myself enjoying his company, whatever it may eventually become. And you deserve exactly that kind of happiness," Sophie said warmly. "After everything you have built and everything you have overcome, you deserve a companion who sees your worth clearly, without needing years to understand it." Elena considered her friend's words thoughtfully, thinking of the long road that had brought her to this quiet, contented place in her life. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had once measured her worth against someone else's approval. Whatever happened with Charles, whether their friendship deepened into something more or remained simply a source of mutual respect and companionship, She understood clearly now that her happiness no longer depended on any single outcome or any other person's validation. She had built that foundation entirely on her own, brick by brick, choice by choice, through years of quiet determination that had asked nothing of anyone but herself. Whatever came next, she would meet it exactly as she had met everything since that rainy morning years before, grounded, clear-eyed, and completely at peace with the remarkable life she had built from nothing but her own resilience and unwavering truth.